Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm doing part 9 of my series on the beliefs of ancient astrologers. So, if you're new to this series, I recommend starting from the beginning and watching sequentially if you can. A lot of the concepts build on one another. But the purpose of this series is to give students of astrology some idea of what the most likely beliefs of the earliest astrologers were about the universe, about God, about the soul, about why we're doing astrology, about where astrology comes from. So, in this ninth part of our series, we are going to talk about. I didn't really have a category for this talk because this almost like this is like the miscellaneous drawer of features of other features of ancient thought that likely had some kind of influence, though there were so many different pieces that I felt like there was just kind of like one drawer to put a bunch of miscellaneous stuff into. But this might be the most interesting of all of the talks I've done in the series because of all of the different ground it covers. In our 10th part of the series, we will be talking about where ancient astrologers believe that astrology itself came from. And we will be concluding on the 10th part of this series with some final thoughts about the nature of astrology from actual source texts, actual quotes that astrologers have given about why they were practicing astrology or what they thought the purpose was or what kind of attitude they took toward it. So we'll go over that in the 10th video, which sort of be like the grand finale. All right. So anyway, today we're going to talk about just a bunch of really interesting features of ancient thought that most likely had some kind of influence on the earliest astrologers. So, and this is, of course, looking at both the East and the West, as I've been doing throughout this series, meaning Indian astrology, which is one seed bed, and Hellenistic astrology, which comes from the Greek-speaking world, but broadly speaking, comes from Egypt, has some background in Mesopotamia and Babylon. So it's the Hellenistic region of the world, and the kind of astrology that was always also practiced widely in the Roman Empire. So, at any rate, they both share a lot in common. So, all of these points you're going to see crossover between the East and the West on all of these points throughout the entire series. Now, here's some of the things that I found really interesting is that we see evidence in both the East and the West of vegetarianism and nonviolence being practices in a number of different groups, religious and spiritual sects or groups or communities. Pacifism, meaning nonviolence, was considered to be beneficial in terms of the trajectory of the soul going into future lifetimes, and also in terms of what kind of karma you might generate in this lifetime. Karma meaning reactions from the gods and from nature and from circumstances around us, which respond and react to our choices, our intentions, our desires. And so if you do bad things, you get bad results. If you do good things, you get good results. There was clearly a belief that just the law of cause and effect carried over into the moral sphere of life. And that doesn't mean that we can always understand exactly why everything happens, because there is also this category of things that happen that we can't seem to connect the dots on causally. And yet there was a great faith in the ancient world that these were that there was no event that was not meaningfully orchestrated by the laws of the universe and by the will of the gods or God. So at any rate, that's interesting, though, is that you see nonviolence towards animals as minimal harm being done. I mean, even in India, you'll see that they're not. It's not lost on Indian people that plants are alive. People will be like, "Well, what about plants? You're killing plants." Well, yeah, plants are alive too, but plants will drop fruits and grow again. You can take parts of plants and they'll continue to grow. There's almost like a spectrum of harm that you could possibly do, and both in the East and the West, you see a number of groups emphasizing vegetarianism, peaceful living, and pacifism. So that's worth noting because to me, well, and I certainly don't want to preach to people about what you should or shouldn't eat, because I know that that can be a really touchy subject. Owning a yoga studio for 10 years, we had to make a lot of choices as yoga studio owners as to whether or not to, broadcast our vegetarianism or elements of veganism or whatever. And it was a tough choice because there's a lot of people who that's going to be a step too far for them, or they may even feel they have really strong reactions if people start preaching at them about peaceful eating or, non-harmful eating or whatever. So at any rate, but you will notice that I have noticed in my life that my astrology practice for several years toward the beginning, I was a vegan. I came out of veganism and, went back to meat eating. And of course, I was eating as clean as I could, but made this transition back to vegetarianism, not strict veganism. In Bhakti, we use certain products like ghee or what have you that are ethically sourced. But at any rate, I just noticed that, when you start pulling out certain elements from your diet, whether it's caffeine or sugar or alcohol or, just those elements of the diet that can be really harmful. And for me, meat was one of them. And I noticed that my astrology practice got significantly clearer. And, my mind as a reader was a lot more lucid because of these changes that I made in my diet. So I think it's worth mentioning, even if vegetarianism isn't your thing, that there seems to have been an emphasis on clean diet or an ethical relationship to the way that you eat. And I think that's really important because it speaks to the fact that ancient astrologers most likely were looking at astrology within the context of a holistic lifestyle. And that's the main thing that I wanted to emphasize. Also, nonviolence, there you go. So of course, astrologers have been paired in courts of kings and have aided in predictions about war, when to go to war, when not to go to war. But when you look at the roots of Hellenistic astrology, Indian astrology, and its ties with Vedic religion, you're looking by and large at cultures that emphasize pacifism. And not to say that there wasn't a season for all things either, but pacifism seems to have been a way of life for many of these ancient mystical schools. Anyway, we also see the importance of evangelizing certain techniques, doctrines, and teachings, and the importance of trying to enlighten the public, as well as the fear of what the public may do if you share or preach or teach others about enlightening topics. So you'll see, for example, Plato mentioning this about the prisoners in the allegory of the cave, which is an allegory about people stuck in delusion and ignorance and the spiritual path of coming into an understanding of truth and divinity. And when the prisoner exits the cave and sees things as they are and has an enlightening experience and goes back in, there's a warning that Plato gives that essentially this person could be killed by trying to wake other people up, by trying to stir them from their sleep. They may get mad and they may actually kill him. So of course we have to imagine that just like today, there were also probably fanatics and zealots and people whose egos were invested, in converting everyone else in a way that, is violent and so forth. That's always been a part of that's always like the shadow of religious experience, and the desire to share something that is true and good becomes distorted, and the ego capitalizes on it for, its own selfish motivations or kind of conquest. But you will see in both the East and the West the importance of trying to teach and share with the public the nature of truth, of divinity, of the soul, of the afterlife, of the good life, or of the ethical and holistic life. So you do see that there's an emphasis placed on that. And what has that told me today as an astrologer? That if astrology isn't teaching us how to be better people, if there isn't, I know it's like a dirty word, but if there isn't an evangelical component to astrology, in other words, if astrologers aren't out there trying to enlighten the public, not just tell them about the future or help us to get more fixated on ourselves and our own behavior or psychology, in a kind of almost like a narcissistic way, but if we're not teaching people about truth and helping people to become free from delusions, and if we're not helping people to use astrology as a tool for spiritual happiness, health, harmony, then it doesn't seem to fall in line with what the most likely beliefs of the ancient astrologers were. So I think that's worth mentioning, that I think astrology is missing something without that. And that's why I personally feel compelled, because when I look at what astrology's done for me and I look at how it was shared to me, I realize that this is how astrology has been passed on. It's been shared with a certain degree of charisma, knowing that this is a healing and almost like medicinal science. So astrologers are like doctors of the stars, and we administer the medicine of these heavenly bodies, by grace. And so that's part of what we have to think. That's part of what we have to do. Anyway, just my 2 cents, but it's interesting to find that that was shared in the ancient world. We see something similar to what we might call a missionary here in the West, in both the East and the West. For example, you have the Jains, Buddhists, yogis, all sending out missionaries to the West, to different places in the world to talk to people about the nature of the Atman and Brahman. And you have the Buddhists going and teaching about, the Buddha nature. And you have even Plato describes the duty of the enlightened philosopher as a kind of missionary work, as the need is there to educate and enlighten the general public. But he also said it could be dangerous. And we know that many of these, in any tradition, again, the missionary impulse can become perverted or corrupt. And also it's possible that people will harass or even harm those who are trying to share something that would take a person out of their delusion. Like, people don't want to give up their delusion, so they can become violent. Anyway, now on the other hand, and this part I find really interesting, there was also an emphasis in both the East and the West on the importance of ritual secret teachings, or that there's an esoteric dimension to these traditions that is not widely shared or broadcasted, that one can only penetrate by means of gradually immersing oneself in something. So to the lay person, that, I'll give an example with my YouTube channel. There's my YouTube channel is like, there's a sort of superficiality to the astrology on my everyday YouTube channel compared to the deeper spaces that we go into in my classrooms. So as a soul meets with a teacher or a path of some kind out in the world and says, that's really interesting, and a little, like a light bulb turns on, that one is not expected to be receiving the deepest teachings in that space, that the people are going out basically to share or bring people in, but that the deepest teachings can't be accessed until you actually go very deeply into it. And on that level, those teachings are considered to be secret, esoteric, and hidden. There's an occult nature to them. And the protection of that occult nature is written right into the source texts themselves, where you'll see astrologers talking about, people being cursed if they misuse this information, or if they are approaching it for selfish gain or something like that. So there's both a level at which people are going out and trying to share and teach people, but then there's also, this sense in which you can't get the deepest levels of information until you go into them yourself, because those levels are not shared with the public, and they have to be kept in a kind of alembic, an alchemical cooking pot that, you can't get the benefit of unless you put yourself in and seal the lid. Basically, it's like, if you want to go really deeply into astrology and really get into the deepest alchemical power of astrology, you have to deeply immerse yourself in the study of it. But there's also a level at which you can check in and listen to daily videos, or you can get a kind of topical level of astrology. And so there's always these two levels working at once in the ancient world, where there's both the need to bring people in, and then also a need to hide or protect the deepest teachings or essence of things. And that's, you see that in Hermeticism. You see elements of that, hinted at by Plato. Certainly the Orphics. You think about the some of the mystery schools, and you think also, of course, of like the Egyptian mysteries. And so those things are not, it's not always like just that there's just this, some sects are like closed door, nobody can get in, and other sects are just wide open to people. Mostly it seems to be the case that a lot of things were broadly circulating. Teachers would go out and tell people about things, but then if you wanted the deepest stuff, you wouldn't get that on the street, so to speak. So that's really interesting, and it reminds me of how we should be carrying astrology today, which I think, without even knowing any of this, I was embodying, which is that, I do a certain level of superficial work, but same thing is true with my clients. I can't get into the deepest parts of a birth chart with someone in one reading. It usually takes several readings over a couple of years to get, really deeply into something. You can't get into astrology at the deepest level if you only take it in little sound bites, here or there. You got to find teachers that you like and really go deeply. So there's always those two levels, the kind of external street level, and we'll call it the internal occult level, working in astrology. And that seems to have been around for thousands of years anyway. This is funny, but a lot of people, when they start studying ancient astrology, seem to think that astrologers in both the East and the West were predominantly deterministic, which means that they believe that everything is fated. This does not seem to have been the case. While ancient philosophers and mystics in both the East and the West clearly believed in fate or karma and the transmigration of the soul, they also quite clearly believed that it was our choices that inform our fate. So this is almost the depth of this, and the nuance of how ancient philosophers looked at the relationship between choice and fate is like lost on us as soon as we start talking about fate versus free will. It's like a false dichotomy in the ancient world. And just a simple example, if you imagine that the world, the material energy, is like a billiard ball. It's like a pool table, and there's billiard balls always in motion going around it, and there's never been a beginning to the motion and hitting and striking and movements of the billiard balls, and there'll never be an end to it. So they're always moving around, hitting one another, bouncing off one another. That's sort of the material energy. And the planets and all of their constant motions and interactions and aspects are like a reflection of those fluctuations of material energy. And what you have to imagine is that you're taking a soul and you're putting it into one of the balls on the table, when there's just innumerable balls moving on this giant table. And the soul comes into a form, and the form has been many other forms. It's like constantly changing and moving around this board. And when the soul comes into this form on the table, it has a certain amount of agency, which means not that it controls every movement and not that it can control every reaction around it, but that everything on the board is moving according to laws, cause and effect laws. And those laws are ultimately governed by the gods or Godhead. They keep harmony and order and justice and beauty and truth at all times. But that the soul also has a certain amount of agency to like move. And so your agency is participating on this table where there's also rules and parameters to what can happen. And based on the choices that you make, you do have a certain amount of control over your outcomes, but it's still taking place within the board, on the board and within the rules of the game. And so your fate, it's like the old saying, man proposes, God disposes. So we will something, or we even like moving my hand and doing this my soul has sort of proposed through my mind, my intelligence, my ego, and ultimately through the gross form of the body to move my hand. And my hand is, responding. And the God that operates this hand is not actually me. There's like a God of your hand. This is why we have, Mercury or Gemini associated with the hands. So everything that you're proposing is constantly being approved of or sanctioned and allowed to happen by the gods who orchestrate all of the laws of material nature. And so your choices are constantly playing out in and out through the available rules of the game. And then the reactions that you get based on your choices are, they don't always, you don't always get what you want, it's like the Rolling Stones song, but sometimes you get what you need. So that's the view that ancient astrologers in the East and the West seem to have had, which was that you make choices and you get reactions based on the will and judgments of the gods of your heart and your intentions, and they can see at a deeper level than we can sometimes even see and understand our own motivations. And we have agency, and our fate is brought to us by virtue of what we're intending, desiring, fearing, etc. And we actually, again, we do have freedom, but it's taking place within the parameters of, the physics of the pool table, so to speak. So, and the gods watch over all of that. So to say that they were deterministic versus, that they were into fate and not free will is not really accurate. And they also believed that, that your choices and even different forms of magic and ritual could appease the gods and change their will or change their mind or manipulate the material energies. So they certainly were not deterministic in that regard. And they often debated the interaction between fate, free will, and this kind of propitiating the gods or using different talismanic magics. And so that it was quite rich, in fact, the way that they understood the interaction between these energies and our will and the will of the gods. I think that's important because as soon as you start studying and you go, oh, they were so deterministic and fatalistic. No, they really weren't. They had a really sophisticated view of fate and free will's interaction together. They saw them as you can't separate them. So at any rate, some groups and philosophers were far more deterministic than others. That is true, but there's no clear evidence that early astrologers were 100% deterministic in their outlook. That's just not the case. There's also clear evidence in both the East and the West, like I was saying, that magical ceremonies, talismans, magical devices were sometimes recommended or used by astrologers in order to counteract or remediate the effects of bad karma, an ill-fated natal chart signature, to please or manipulate, please the gods or manipulate energies. This was, however, controversial back then. For example, Zoisimos wrote, Hermes, legendary founder of astrology, condemns even the Magian science, saying that the spiritual man, one who has come to know himself, need not rectify anything through the use of magic, not even if it is considered a good thing, nor must he force upon necessity, but rather allow necessity to work in accordance with her own nature and decree. So here you have, and you'll see this as a competing, it's a dialogue, it's a debate in the ancient world. To what extent is trying to artificially manipulate the energies or appease the gods or ask them for something, to what extent is that actually a good thing? And to what extent could that be a very dangerous thing for the soul? To what extent is it a devil's bargain? To what extent is it intelligent interaction with nature? I'm not going to land on one side of the debate or the other, but I will say that one thing that this brings to my mind in the modern day is that we essentially see the same thing. We see a lot of people selling programs and different kinds of spiritual, what do we want to say, teachings that have to do with trying to manipulate energies or manipulate circumstances to get what you want. And in the ancient world, by and large, the philosophy, again, to name the big groups, the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Stoics, Hermeticists, Orphics, the yogis, the Vedantists, these groups, the most likely progenitors of horoscopic astrology, are saying your happiness is found in the very nature of being itself and the very nature of who and what you are now, not in the twists and turns of fortune, which, if you try to manipulate, will only entangle you further. My wife is an herbalist. I spent 10 years drinking ayahuasca, which is a very potent and, one could argue, magical medicine that helps a person to purge, cleanse, heal. So I find that there's sometimes a very fine line with this conversation. But what I would say generally is that I'm not sure that we're doing astrology in the modern world in line with the way that our ancient ancestors did, if we are using it purely to try to enhance our ego's attachments to outcomes rather than learning to surrender at a deeper level. I think that it could go too far. There's some religions, for example, I know that like won't take medicines or something like that, or that it's almost like there'll be such a deep level of surrender that we forget that we're also in a participatory reality where we, the billiard balls on the pool table don't want to, you don't just need to be passive victim to a circumstance or experience. We need to make choices and build relationships with reality. And so I think, along the way, there's a certain level at which learning to flow with the nature of the cosmos and the changes and fluctuations of these energies requires skillful interaction with them. But is that skillful interaction for the sake of getting my next Ferrari, or is it because, I'm trying to be healthy, or I'm trying to take care of myself or others? So I think intentionality behind a lot of this matters a great deal. It's very clear that many ancient astrologers were herbalists. For example, herbalism and astrology have a very old relationship with one another. Ayurveda and astrology have a very old relationship with one another. So there's medicinal herbs, knowing how and when to pick them under what astrological influences to get what kind of effect. Being completely hands off seems to me like as big of a mistake as someone who was constantly trying to manipulate every energy, wear every amulet possible to get stuff. So somewhere in the middle is where I find myself landing. But I do think that, when modern astrology overemphasizes obsessing about the perfect time to do something in order to get some result, and there's a lot of like egotistical energy invested in me and what I want. And then I think we're starting to border on what it does appear that a lot of ancient astrologers condemned. Like early astrologers seem to have specifically said, no, that's not what we're here to do. We're here to learn how to see divinity in the ups and downs of fortune and to find joy in the soul itself. And I think if that's the spirit behind how we're interacting with these energies, then I think it's good. And that's kind of, at least that's the philosophy that I work with. Anyway, so I hope you guys have found this interesting today. Just like I said, a grab bag of different features of ancient thinking that I thought were interesting. Didn't really have enough to do on any one of them, so I just threw them all together in like the miscellaneous drawer. So in our final talk in the series, we'll talk about where ancient astrologers believed astrology itself came from and some of the quotes and passages from ancient astrologers about astrology itself to conclude the series. So I hope you guys have been enjoying this. Don't forget my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, starts in June. Early bird is available right now. So you can sign up and save a bunch if you sign up now before the class starts and pay in full. There's payment plans. There's need-based tuition if you need it. Then you can go to the website, nightlightastrology.com. If you got questions about the course, email info@nightlightastrology.com. And I hope you guys have a beautiful day today. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.